This video is brought to you by pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all sorts of great Canadian products made by Canadian creators. Enjoy!
In the autumn of 1672, Governor Courcelle was replaced by Governor Louis de Bouade Comte de Frontenac, a courtier of King Louis XIV and a battle-scarred veteran of both the Dutch War of Independence and the more recent Cretan War. Governor Frontenac was eager to expand the reaches of the colony and inaugurate a new era or prosperity in New France. A year after his appointment, he asked Louis Joliet, a Quebec-born Jesuit seminarian turned fur trader and the brother of Adrien Joliet, whom La Salle and company had encountered during their failed expedition in search of the Northwest Passage, with exploring the upper reaches of the great river of which the Jesuits had learned from their Indian congregations, the Mississippi. Joliet paddled up the Ottawa River and across Lake Huron to St. Ignace, a Jesuit mission located on the mainland near the fur-trading fort of Michilimackinac. There he was joined by 5 voyagers and a missionary named Jacques Marquette, a pioneer who had established the St. Ignace mission and the northerly settlement of Sault Ste. Marie, located at the opposite side of the upper peninsula of Michigan. The company paddled their canoes across Lake Michigan to Green Bay. They then traveled south up the Fox River, portaged overland to the Wisconsin River, and followed that waterway south to the Mississippi. During the course of their journey, they met with a number of Indian bands, all of whom insisted on feeding them morsels of food by hand. They also came across a startling riverside pictograph depicting a piasa bird, a bearded, horned, scaly, winged monster of native mythology, which appears to mark the territory of Cohica, Illinois Indians. During their exploration of the upper reaches of the Mississippi, Joliet and Marquette learned from the Indians they met that the Mississippi must be the same waterway whose mouth the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto had discovered 130 years prior. It emptied into the Gulf of Mexico, the territory of the Spanish Empire, and not into the Pacific Ocean as they had hoped. Fearful of falling into the hands of the Spanish, they traveled back up the Mississippi, further up the Illinois River, and portaged to the Chicago River, which they followed to Lake Michigan. While Joliet and Marquette were undertaking their epic journey towards the Mississippi, La Salle and Governor Frontenac were hatching a plan to expand the French-Canadian fur trade westward and strengthen France's colonial position in the so-called Pays d'Eau, or Upper Country, surrounding the Great Lakes while lining their own pockets in the process. At that time, the Great Lakes region was dominated by the warlike Iroquois Confederacy, allies of the Dutch, and the English, who had wiped out or displaced the native Huron, Erie, Neutral, and Petun nations in the 1640s and 50s. The French and their Algonquin allies had warred with the Iroquois throughout the early 1660s, making peace in 1666, just before La Salle's arrival in New France. Independent French-Canadian fur traders called coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, had since taken their trade to the Iroquois, who had recently settled around the Great Lakes, making long canoe journeys through the wilderness to trade knives, hatchets, beads, and other implements to these Indians in exchange for furs. Governor Frontenac conceived of a method by which he might steal this business away from the coureurs de bois for the benefit of himself and the colony, while at the same time protecting New France from the future Iroquois incursions and the encroachment of the colony's English and Dutch rivals, the establishment of a fort on the shores of Lake Ontario. The establishment of such a fort would be a risky endeavor, as King Louis XIV had discouraged the construction of forts and trading posts outside the valley of the St. Lawrence River, out of fear that this might spread New France excessively thin, making it vulnerable to future Iroquois or English attacks. Frontenac, operating on the principle that it better to ask forgiveness than to seek permission, decided to establish the fort without first obtaining the king's approval. He recruited an eager La Salle to assist him in achieving this end. Frontenac put his plan into motion by organizing a formal inspection of the French settlements along the St. Lawrence River, from Quebec to Lake Ontario. The secret purpose of this operation was to demonstrate the military might of New France to the Iroquois of the Great Lakes. Using La Salle as his emissary, Frontenac organized a meeting with the great chiefs of the Iroquois Confederacy at the mouth of the Cataraqui River, near the head of the St. Lawrence, the site of present-day Kingston, Ontario. The meeting between the governor and the heads of the Iroquois nations took place in mid-July 1673. Frontenac arrived at the designated location at the head of a large and impressive complement of militiamen from Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. After exchanging gifts and speeches with the natives, Frontenac met with each of the Iroquois chiefs in his personal pavilion, treating them and their families to fine French food and expressing his regret, through an interpreter, that he did not yet speak their language. In the series of councils that followed, the governor made it clear to the Iroquois that he desired to maintain the peace they had established, but would make a terrible enemy if provoked. Throughout the course of these meetings, Frontenac's men hastily constructed a palisaded fortification within sight of the council tent, ostensibly in an effort to impress the Iroquois with their defensive capabilities. The Frenchmen named their new post Fort Conti. To the governor's delight, King Louis XIV allowed the fort to stand, despite its having been constructed without his blessing. In the fall of 1674, La Salle traveled to France and sought audience with King Louis XIV. Armed with a letter of recommendation from Frontenac, he requested that the king appoint him the commander of Fort Conti, which La Salle decided to rename Fort Frontenac, after his benefactor. King Louis XIV granted La Salle's request, and the adventurer returned to New France to assume command of his new post and supervise the construction of a stone and mortar fortress in place of the palisaded fort. On his return journey, he was accompanied by 2 Recollect Franciscan friars who were to live at Fort Frontenac, one of them a Fleming named Louis Hennepin. Throughout the years that followed, La Salle divided most of his time between Fort Frontenac and Paris, France. His large market share in the fur trading industry earned him many enemies in New France, resulting in several attempts to entrap him. Once, while visiting a wealthy farmer in Quebec, his host's wife attempted to seduce him. When La Salle hurried from the room in order to avoid scandal, he found his host on the other side of the door, apparently overseeing the execution of the plot he had orchestrated. On another occasion, a jealous fur trader told the Jesuit priest that La Salle was living with a young unmarried woman at Fort Frontenac. The priest promptly traveled to the fort to rebuke La Salle when he learned that the rumor was false. In the spring of 1677, a pair of Jesuit missionaries spread a false rumor among their Iroquois congregation that La Salle was preparing to make war on them. Governor Frontenac himself met with the Indians to allay their suspicions. Shortly thereafter, a famous fur trader named Nicolas Perrot allegedly attempted to murder La Salle by serving him a salad containing toxic hemlock. Later that year, La Salle made a trip to France for the purpose of convincing the king to grant him permission to establish 2 more forts on the Great Lakes, one of them at the mouth of the Niagara River and the other at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, as well as a sailing vessel on Lake Erie. Louis XIV granted his request, and in July 1678, La Salle sailed for Canada with 30 men, most of them shipwrights, carpenters, or blacksmiths, and an abundance of supplies. Among his crew were a former French Royal Army officer named Dominique Lamotte de Lussière, and a one-handed Italian veteran of the Third Anglo-Dutch War named Henri de Tonty, the latter having been recommended to him by his aristocratic friend, Louis Armand, Prince of Conti. Upon reaching Quebec, La Salle's crew gained a member in Father Louis Hennepin, one of the 2 missionaries from Fort Frontenac, who had come to Quebec to intercept La Salle and join his expedition. Other additions to his crew included Martin Chartier, a French-Canadian voyager who had accompanied Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet on their expedition to the Mississippi, and a Mohegan hunter fluent in a number of Algonquin dialects. Together, the party traveled up the St. Lawrence River to Fort Frontenac. Upon arriving at the fort, La Salle ordered about half of his men to travel by canoe to Lake Michigan and establish a trading relationship with the natives there. That accomplished, they would await for him at Lake Michigan's Green Bay. He then sent the other half of his employees, including Hennepin and Lamotte, to sail in a small ship to the mouth of Niagara River, where he would later build a fort. La Salle himself, along with Henri de Tonty, made a separate trip to a nearby Indian village to secure winter provisions for his crew. By now, it was late November, the month during which the waters of the Great Lakes are the roughest. Hennepin, Lamotte, and company managed to sail their vessel along the northern shore of Lake Ontario to the mouth of the Humber River, near present-day Toronto, before their ship became encased in ice. The adventurers managed to liberate their vessel with axes and make their way across the lake to the mouth of the Niagara River. They disembarked on the river's eastern shore and made camp. Father Hennepin and a few others, desirous of seeing the Niagara Falls, continued up the river in canoes and disembarked at the foot of what is now Kingston Heights on the western side of the river, with the Niagara Falls in plain view. A few of the explorers then made their way on foot to the western base of the cataract. Excepting perhaps a few earlier Jesuit missionaries who failed to write about the experience, Hennepin and his companions thus became the first white men to see Niagara Falls. Before laying the foundations for the fort, which La Salle had decided to name Fort Conti in honor of his aristocratic Parisian friend, Lamont, Hennepin, and company decided to trek overland to a westerly Seneca village situated near the present site of Rochester, New York, where they hoped to receive the blessing of the local Iroquois chiefs. Although the chiefs were pleased with the gifts the adventurers brought them, they neglected to acknowledge whether or not they would tolerate this new French fort on the banks of the Niagara. Disappointed by this setback, the adventurers trudged back to the river. Not long after their return, they were joined by La Salle and Tonty, who arrived with building supplies, but had lost much of their provisions during an accident on the lake. La Salle decided to speak with the Iroquois chiefs himself, and succeeded in convincing them to approve his enterprise. The adventurers returned to the eastern shores of the Niagara and proceeded to build Fort Conti. In January 1679, while the construction of Fort Conti was well underway, a portion of La Salle's crew hauled a quantity of supplies up the Niagara River and above the Niagara Falls. At the mouth of what is probably Cayuga Creek, they set to constructing a sizable 7-cannon bark intended for service on Lake Erie. The construction of this vessel was an unpleasant task for La Salle's men, who labored with frozen fingers and empty stomachs, all the while wary of the sullen Iroquois braves who frequently loitered around the work site. While his men worked on the ship and the fort, La Salle himself, accompanied by 2 of his employees, traveled by snowshoe through the forest and across the frozen Lake Ontario to Fort Frontenac, where he hoped to replenish the provisions he had lost in the lake. During La Salle's absence, the men on the Niagara River completed both the fort and the 45-ton ship. The latter was christened Le Griffon, or the Griffin, this mythological monster being the primary ornament on Count Frontenac's coat of arms. Its prow bore a wooden carving of the legendary half-lion, half-eagle, for which it was named, and its decks bristled with 7 small cannons which were fired at its christening. La Salle finally returned to the Niagara River in early August, this time accompanied by 3 more Flemish friars. Eager to make use of the new ship, he and all his men embarked on Le Griffon and set out on her maiden voyage across Lake Erie. For 3 days the explorers sailed down the length of the lake. On the 4th day they turned north and sailed up the Detroit River. They crossed Lake St. Clair beyond and proceeded up the St. Clair River and into Lake Huron. There the explorers were beset by a ferocious gale which threatened to capsize their vessel. Praying to St. Anthony of Padua, the patron saint of mariners, the sailors managed to make their way up Lake Huron to the island of Michilimackinac, a haven for Coureurs de Bois, home to Huron and Ottawa Indian villages, and Father Jacques Marquette's old St. Ignace mission. La Salle and his crew received a cool welcome from the Jesuits, in whose chapel they celebrated Mass. The explorers were subsequently greeted by the local Huron and Ottawa Indians, who were amazed at the size of their ship. During their visit, they received the disheartening news that most of the 15 men whom La Salle had previously sent to establish a trading relationship with the Indians of Lake Michigan had squandered his trading goods and abandoned their mission. In early September, La Salle and the crew of the Griffin sailed west from Michilimackinac into Lake Michigan and further southwest into Green Bay. There, on an island, he found a few members of his advance party who had remained loyal to him, discovering to his pleasure that they had acquired a small fortune in furs from their trade with the natives. La Salle then had these furs loaded onto the cargo hold of the Griffin and ordered a handful of his men to transport them to Fort Conti, asking the ship's pilot to return to Lake Michigan as soon as the cargo was unloaded. The Griffin departed on September 18, 1679, just as a storm began to brew. Aside from the vessel's own crew, La Salle and his explorers were the last men to set eyes on the Griffin. The vessel was lost with all hands somewhere in the waters of Lake Michigan, Huron, or Erie. Today, its undiscovered wreck is widely considered the holy grail of Great Lakes shipwreck hunters.